Episode 3, 4 Idols. I stated previously that what we need are smashers of idols. And thank God he has raised up idol smashers for all the many idols that man has set up to replace him. We tend to forget that each idol was once a fearsome entity that demanded worship on pain of death. Now they're bywords for evil, or worse, bywords for stupidity. How could anyone believe in that one? This has the tendency to reduce idols worshippers like the Nazis to nothing more than movie villains, and then to parodies of movie villains. That reminds me of a question raised during the promotion of the movie Inglourious Basterds. Boy, was that a bad movie. It asked, who is your favorite screen Nazi? I suppose I would have said the German tank commander in Kelly's Heroes, but a more interesting question would be, who's your favorite Nazi? I mean real Nazi. And you can't say Hitler because that wouldn't be fair. I'll tell you what I'm thinking. Himmler was a nasty fellow, but a twit. Gould was made to look amateurish by Jen Paskey and the cast of CNN. Hess was a cowardly traitor. Albert Speer was a grandiose architect and got the German economy rolling, too late as it turned out. But he just wasn't Nazi-ish enough. There were hosts of quality German commanders, Rommel, Kesselring, Manstein, Guderian, etc. But their Prussian snootiness just couldn't appreciate the Bavarian corporal. I don't think they really had their heart in the whole Nazi thing. No, I think I'm going to have to go with Hermann Göring. I really like the fat fashionista vibe with the fancy revolvers, sort of a George Patton look, but plumper. He did build up a fearsome air force. You might say he drove it into the ground with mismanagement and corruption, but the Allies had a lot to do with that too. So that's my pick for my favorite Nazi, Hermann Göring. Let me know your favorite Nazi in the comments section, and I'll send you a pizza roll. Anyways, it's time to give you a brief enumeration of the idols that our heroes must smash if we are to save ourselves and our civilization. Number 1, equality. The idol of equality is, at its heart, the attempt to make man God. The lust for equality is the lust to have a complete power of self-invention, inequality presuming some pre-existing nature in the person or the world that limits one's conceit of self-creation. The self-creation of the cult is explicit. They demand that everyone follow their personal fantasy at gunpoint. Now, we have Americans who are demanding critical race theory be removed from their children's schools. That is encouraging as far as it goes, but CRT is not the craziness of woke fanatics. CRT is the logical conclusion of the idol of equality. The cult is simply taking the principle of self-invention more seriously than you, discarding your unprincipled limitations and employing the power of the state coercion for their ends. It might be that the rest of Americans have more modest ambitions of self-creation, perhaps tempered by other, wiser principles. And so they make elevating minority groups the national hobby, but expect them to avoid becoming dependent and self-entitled. Or they expect that women should have a dream career and children, and this will have no consequences on either her marriage or her children. Or perhaps they imagine that two men can be married, move to the suburbs, and become responsible neighbors like a husband and wife. Then when the cult announces that men can turn themselves into women, they recoil in horror. The line must be drawn here, this far, no further. As it turns out, CRT, #MeToo, transgender grooming, and chemical castration of children is your idol of equality. Nothing that you are fighting is the least bit surprising if you realize that God has made human beings, and human beings have not made themselves. The defense that is made for the idol of equality is that if we don't believe men and groups of men are equal, then one group will oppress another. But this problem is of the idolaters' making. They have made the fungibility of mankind the basis for equality. They actually propose that we are to give justice to one another, not on the basis of justice, but on the basis that no one is better than us. The actual basis of justice is because God made justice. The basis for treating others with respect is because they have value before God, not because we pretend they are equivalent to us. Then there's the cop-out. There is only one race, the human race. No, sorry. The long-standing identification of races within mankind appears to be sound to me, But if you prefer ethnic group, nationality, or people group, I'm cool with that too. The terminology is not the issue here. The dispute is not whether race is an appropriate term to classify humans by, but if we are allowed to classify humans at all. The idol of equality states that we are not to classify humans, may not observe and categorize, may not use reason to connect similar things and call them by a common name. For such characterization, categorization implies a limitation on man's self-creation. So the idol of equality is really the rebellious effort to deny cause and effect, action and consequence, sowing and reaping. Equality is the evocation of magical power to deny the law of God and the nature he has given us. With this smasher of idols, say that God did create the sexes and peoples and made them different one another. And furthermore, that we may observe, categorize, and act upon these categories, even as we recognize the limitations of categories and the demands of justice. The victim fetish. The next idol is the victim fetish. The belief, originally from Rousseau, that victimhood imparts both innocence and virtue on the victim, or at least on those who can claim to be victims. This is the inversion of the redemption of Christ, righteousness through one's own suffering, or from people who claim to be connected to it. To reject the virtue of the declared victim is blaming the victim, which, as it usually turns out, is a good idea. This idol, so beloved by Americans over the past several decades, is simply pride, a self-righteous arrogation of merit because something bad has happened to you, or because you sympathize with someone else's victimhood. But neither suffering nor sympathy bestows merits on anyone. Americans have discovered that they do not like to have their children taught that they are oppressors just because they are born white, but this blood libel stems from spending their life treating blacks as victims and dehumanizing those who didn't show the proper obsequience to the sacred victim. Americans just imagined they could avoid having this libel turned on them. Christians too have joined into this, even those who are rightly denouncing the more flagrant abuses of the victim fetish. In Christianity, one is righteous by identification with the death of Christ. The one dies to oneself and takes on the life of Christ. But even our Orthodox churches preach an additional righteousness is required through the identification with the death of George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, and the many other victims the cult supplies them. The blood of Jesus does not sufficiently cleanse us, but the blood of George Floyd can make up the difference. Americans are then shocked that most Americans reject the gospel because they don't think that they are sinners in need of forgiveness, there being sufficient righteousness obtainable by the outrage of the plentiful straw men the cult parades before them. Number 3, the sexy party. For most of my life, the main attraction of not being a Republican was the conceit that one wasn't a frustrated sexual prude, that one was part of the sexy party. The lengths to which Americans would go to convince themselves that they were sexually liberated, sexually satisfied, sexually confident was legendary, even those who were happily married. I think it was actually to Bill Clinton's advantage to exploit and rape women. It allowed Americans to remain safely monogamous while identifying with a sexual predator against the harping prudes of the Republican Party. The primary result of the sexual revolution has been to replace actual sexual intercourse with sexiness. That is the commodity of pairing that one could have sex. It used to be that Americans had sex, and I would imagine quite a lot of it. But the cultural capital that produces a lot of sex, that is chastity before marriage, fidelity during marriage, and modesty towards all, was dissatisfying to the cult, who wanted sexiness, which is to say, self-invention. The chastity, fidelity, and modesty had to be lied about so they could be denial, shame, and frustration. Then came the inevitable realization that sexual liberation gave women nothing more than the conceit of being like men. Women then retreated into their natural condition when their economic, psychological, and spiritual needs are frustrated, which is being distinctly uninterested in sex. The cultural capital that understood the sexual economy between men and women and permitted both to be fulfilled was eroded away. Women tried to take power from men, becoming nagging bullies. Men became resentful and exploitive, or frustrated and angry. Ultimately, sex became completely disconnected from intercourse and became what the cult wanted, personal self-invention. Self-invention led to the ridiculous claims of 57 genders that no one could have sex with, In the end, sexual revolution has produced more confusion, frustration, and discontentment than existed before it. The reason for this is because God has made humans and made marriage for humans, not as the frustration of the sexual impulse, but as the proper fulfillment of it. But the sexy idol demands that the only limitation on sex is consent. As it is, when consent becomes the only standard by which intercourse is judged, it is necessary to manufacture consent, the latter end of which we see in mass grooming and the rape of children. The measure of this idol's power is there are a great many Americans who profess to hate grooming, but still act as though there is such thing as a homosexual. I mean a person that is in their nature homosexual. But homosexuality is a deviancy, both biologically and morally. As the reduction of intercourse to consent made deviance acceptable, homosexual deviance made every other deviance inevitable. Smashing this idol will mean confessing that there is a standard for gender and for intercourse, both of which are revealed to us and which we do not make up. Number 4, I am the judge. The foremost idol that needs to be thrown down is the idol that says, I know what truth and justice are. Don't bother me with Jesus Christ. To phrase this another way, it's the idol that men can, from their own intellectual resources, identify right and wrong. The corollary being that if I think something is just fine, who are you to tell me otherwise? It will be our most insidious idol, and then we will see the most resistance to smashing. There will be many people in our recently assembled alliance of woke-hating, elite-despising rebels against the deep state who can give all the right reasons for hating, despising, and rebelling. I'm certainly glad to have you as an ally against our common enemies. May victory be ours. But the idol says, you saw through the cult's lies. You perceived their injustice. You measured their actions against standards you identified. Should I say, the Logos of God, Jesus Christ, revealed this to you? I imagine many of you will respond, yes, that's good and fine. You just keep your Christianity at the down low. The origin of this idol is the fundamental principle of modernity, and therefore of the cult, and all the other tyrannical ideologies that have bloodied the past century. The principle of the autonomous, independent mind of man is the conceit that the mind of man, in its own independent capacity, has the capability of discerning truth and judging the world. It has made man the measure and measurer of all things, even the righteousness of God, should man deign to consider him real. Americans will assert that they know that transgenderism is rubbish, that they know COVID vaccine mandates are tyranny, that they know equality of outcome is injustice. They will attribute this knowledge to philosophy or experience or some other source. But that just means it is attributed to their own personal intellectual resources. So don't you try to foist your religion on me, baby. They can stay in control and define what standards they will or will not conform to. Now, men do have a great capacity for reason, and that is because Christ, their Creator, gives it to them, or stops giving it to them, so that they descend into madness and self-destruction. See, humans are dependent beings. That means we are not autonomous or independent in mind, body, or spirit. We function because life has been given to us by grace. Grace just being a fancy word for God giving you something just because he wants to. The withdrawal of life supplied by Christ results in death. Death for body, mind, or spirit may not come at the same time or all at once, but is the inevitable result of life not being constantly pumped into us. This means that you don't know right or wrong, liberty or tyranny, left or right, your head from a hole in the ground, apart from God imparting this ability to you. Scriptures promise that when God Almighty is glorified, he sustains and blesses nations. When men declare themselves to be the determiners of justice, when they attribute goodness to their own resources, he turns these men over their own self-deception and self-destruction. As C.S. Lewis demonstrates in The Abolition of Man, all appeals to right and wrong, be they Christian or otherwise, draw from one standard, or Tao, or natural law. There are differences between cultures and religions, but all are drawing from a single conception of justice. This law is not derived from philosophy or pure reason or from evolution. This law is a revelation. is given to man from outside of man. This revelation is Christ, the Logos of God, at work in mankind apart from Christianity, apart from the life of Jesus, apart from the law of Moses. Men may have mangled or twisted this revelation. They may have mixed it with their tribal priorities. They may have decorated with various accoutrements of myth, but whatever they had that was true justice came from the Logos. Christianity and Judaism are the works of God to reveal the nature of the Logos and to cleanse his law from corruption, not invent an entirely new law. Our idol has claimed, since the so-called Enlightenment, that we can just look into ourselves, our own reason, and pluck justice out of it. Or they propose to establish justice and truth on the empirical, that which can be independently verified by sensory data. Unfortunately, the empirical tells no one anything about purpose, meaning, or value, and so men smuggle in their own purpose, meaning, and value from some other source. Americans will point out that they can look at the actions of the woke and reason out their failures. Indeed, some of you are very good at explaining why it has failed, but the ability to think logically, to understand cause and effect, to distinguish truth and falsehood are not inherent capabilities of mankind. They are potentials that must be imparted and sustained by the grace of Christ. This is because Christ is not just the mediator between man and God. He's the mediator between man, and between man and reality. He's the creator. All things are made by him and for him, and in him all things hold together. Another way of saying this is that he is the basis upon which reality is discernible. So you may be pleased that you have the faculty that allows you to perceive that masks don't work, or reason out that the 2020 election was stolen, or deduce that socialism produces poverty. And that faculty is him. I conclude then with the declaration that we do in fact need idol smashers to defeat the cult that is destroying our nation. They need not have legendary physical or mental prowess, although they could use the Duke's steely gaze. They might fight with elections or legal maneuvers, or they might fight with rifles, or maybe both. It's a matter of tactics. But they're not going to fight because of the deep state or the CDC or the World Economic Forum. Those things are certainly serious problems, but they are not the motive of the heroes. Nor will it be because of some vague concept of freedom borrowed from the residual capital of a stronger and freer time, or a general resentment against the sacred victim. Now, these are certainly good reasons to fight, but the hero does not rely on the capital of stronger ages, nor upon his personal resentment, however justified that might be. No, the hero will destroy the cult in our midst, the idol that man is God and the state is the ultimate embodiment of man's power. He destroys it in his own heart. Then he smashes its physical manifestation. Both of them. He can fight because he is silenced, robbed, degraded, or oppressed, but instead he will fight because he has identified with Christ's interests over his own. Not that the smasher of idols should expect to be welcomed, even by those he is protecting. The accusation will come from our fellow conservatives, just as it came from David's elder brother. Why have you come down here? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And we will reply, like David did, what have I done now? Is there not a cause?
See, we're just a private enterprise operation.
You, the American Army.
No, baby, we ain't.